Thank you for the generous introduction. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to the organizers of the Camden Conference for giving me this opportunity to address you. I should hasten to start by saying that my focus today will be different from most of the other speakers in the conference. I'm going to interpret the challenges of Asia concept, not so much from the point of view of challenge for the United States, or from the point of view of foreign policy or security policy. I'm going to look into it more as a challenge for Asia, particularly challenges faced by the 2.5 billion people who live in these two countries, China and India. I'm an economist. I'm going to talk primarily of economic issues, but also talk a little bit about politics. But I should also mention something that I'm not going to talk about is short-run macroeconomic issues. For example, things like the global financial recession. Of course, these two countries have tided over the problems better than the Western countries in general, but I'm not going to talk about those. I'm going to confine myself to somewhat long-term structural issues. In general, my focus is to qualify some of the conventional wisdom that's been accumulating about the economic rise of China and India. I recently published a book with a very similar title, Awakening Giants, Feet of Clay. I believe the book may be on display outside the auditorium. And so I will not have time to go over the different ways I qualify the conventional wisdom. If you are interested, you can look up the book. I'll just give a few examples. But before I do that, let me start with historical footnote. And that is something that my previous speaker also alluded to. So what I have, if I may, so these are percentage of world income over the last nearly 200 years. So this is 1820. 1820, China contributed about 1/3 of world income. The next, I don't know why India is red, not China, but this is India. This is 16%. So between China and India, these two countries had half of world income in 1820. This little bit of here is Japan. And even smaller, this is the United States. And this, whatever the maroon or purple colored, is the 4 large countries of Europe, about 18%. So that's in 1820. I'm going to jump immediately to 1950. In 1950, these two countries, China and India, contributed 9% of world income. A huge fall from about half of world income to 9% of world income. A lot of things happened in between, including rather unpleasant encounters both of these countries had with international powers. In order to save time, I'm going to jump to a projection. This is 2025. 15 years, less than 15 years from now. The projection, not a prediction, projection on current growth rates, etc., China would have about 25% of world income. India, 11%. So the two together would have about 36% of world income. This is the United States. United States in 1950 was 27%. Here it's about 18%. In 2025, this is Japan, this is 4 large countries of Europe. So for China and India, it's a partial restoration, not going back to what it was in 1820, but it's a significant change from 1950. In 1870s, as well as in the 1970s, in terms of per capita income, India was ahead of China in 1870s as well as in the 1970s. But since then, China has surged, particularly since 1990, way ahead. Even discounting for the fact that I think there is some overestimate in the rates of growth of official Chinese rates of growth, even discounting for that, in terms of per capita income growth over the last quarter century, the Chinese rate on an average has been about twice the per capita income growth rate in India. Just very briefly to tell you a little bit about the pattern or composition of this growth. One is the Chinese pattern of growth, certainly in the earlier part of the last 3 decades, has been more labor intensive, employing lots of people. Success stories in China had been in relatively labor intensive products in the beginning. China is now shifting to more capital intensive, skill intensive products, but certainly in the beginning, the success stories were in export success stories were in garments, shoes, wigs, and toys, and so on. That is not the case in India. Even to this day, the Indian success stories are in skill-intensive products, capital-intensive products, and like skill-intensive, like software, business processing, pharmaceuticals industry, and more recently, in vehicles and car parts. None of these are highly labor-intensive products. This has an implication. The Chinese labor-intensive success, India's skill-intensive success has an implication for poverty, because most people are not skilled people. Most people do not have capital. And that is an implication for Chinese and Indian poverty, to which I'll come in a minute or so. The other issue there I should mention immediately is the sectoral composition of growth. Chinese, as is well known, the Chinese growth pattern has been more in manufacturing. Well, let me not go into this. I don't have time for that, but let me briefly tell you. So Chinese growth composition has been biased in favor of manufacturing, whereas, relatively speaking, India's has been in the service sector. Now, I'm going to qualify this conventional wisdom a little bit. So, for example, China is widely regarded today as the manufacturing workshop of the world. By and large, true, not entirely. As an economist, we look at not the value of output, we look at what we call value added. Value of output minus raw materials, components, spare parts, etc. When you deduct that, the rest is what we call value added. China is not yet the manufacturing center of the world in terms of value added. Let me give you some numbers. In 2009, China contributed of the manufacturing value added in the world, China contributed about 15%, almost the same as Japan. United States, 24%. EU, about 20%. So China, in value-added terms, which is what matters to an economist, is not yet the manufacturing center of the world. It will get there, but not yet. Similarly, let me take the Indian success story in services. So we all now know about the Indian success in software, business processing, in general, information technology enabled services, even at the low-tech end of it, say call centers and things like that. But one should have some sense of proportion. So if you count today all the Indians who are employed in all these IT-enabled services, software, business processing, down to call centers, if you count all of them, what percentage of the Indian workforce does that come to? Most people do not know that if you count all these Indians, they constitute less than 1/2% of the Indian labor force. So this sector, for all its success, is not going to transform the Indian economy. So that's another conventional wisdom that I would like to qualify. Another piece of conventional wisdom is the Chinese success, Chinese growth is primarily export-driven. Yes, Chinese export has been a tremendous success. But the fact is, if you take the economic growth of China in the last 3 decades, it is not primarily export-driven. Even if you take the most successful period, China became a member of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 2001. So even if you take the 2002 to 2007, which is a period of high global expansion of trade, if you take this period, Chinese exports growth contributed a little over 1/4 of the total Chinese economic growth. So the main part of Chinese economic growth is domestic, not exports. It's primarily domestic investment. Same, by the way, is true about India. India's growth primarily is domestically driven, domestic investment. Let me now move to the issue of poverty. And in fact, and very briefly, this reminds me, going back to something that I was talking about a little bit. So before I go to poverty, so one of the standard, again, conventional wisdom that the Chinese growth is unprecedented. Chinese growth is phenomenal, but not unprecedented, even in Asia. So again, growth in terms of value added. So what you have here, the rate of growth of value added in manufacturing primarily, in the first 25 years of growth spurt in 4 major Asian countries. The first 25 years of growth spurt, it started in Japan in 1955 in this figure. It started in Taiwan in 1960. It started in South Korea in 1965. And in China, the growth spurt since 1978. So if you take that growth spurt period, the highest growth of value added in manufacturing, primarily manufacturing, this is South Korea. The second highest is Taiwan. Third is China. And the fourth is Japan. So China has outpaced, in recent years, China has outpaced Japan in terms of growth of value added, but not Korea or Taiwan. So yes, of course, China being very large, it's extremely impressive, but not in terms of growth rate. Now I'm going to come to poverty and inequality. So what you have in these 2 panels, percentage of people below a poverty line. You can choose your poverty line. I'm doing the standard one of the World Bank, $1 a day per capita. In 2005 prices, PPPs, purchasing power parity, to make the prices comparable for these 2 countries, China and India. So what you have is, this is percentage of population from 1981 to 2005, and this is numbers of people in millions in all these years. There are 3 points that I want to make from these 2 panels. The first 2 points are well known, but the third is not. So let me come to them. So in 1981, 73.5% of the people in China were below this $1 a day poverty line. I personally think that's a bit of an overestimate, but let me not ignore that for the time being. So 81, 73.5%. In 2005, 8%, single digit. It's a really extremely impressive performance. And it is even more vivid if you count the numbers of people. 730 million people below the poverty line in 1981, 2005, 106 million. So it's a dramatic change. More than 624 million people were lifted above this poverty line. Never before in history something of that magnitude has happened. India, the decline in percentage of poverty is significant, from 42%, from 24%, but not dramatic like in China. So these are one about the percentage, and the other is about the total numbers. These are well known. Let me go to the third fact, which is not so well known. So when you think about these 624 million people raised above the poverty line, if you read the financial press, even the best of them, The Economist, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and so on, you come away with the impression that much of this, both the decline in poverty, the dramatic decline in China, and the significant decline in India in percentage of poverty, poor people, is primarily due to globalization. That is something that is repeated in the financial media, and through constant repetition is become a part of the conventional wisdom. I'm going to qualify that. So if you look at the Chinese numbers, of these 624 million, see that more than half were raised above the poverty line by 1987. So more than half of this huge rise in or lifting of people above the poverty line happened already by 1987. If you now think about the global integration of China, that happened largely later. As I already told you, China became a member of WTO in 2001, but global integration in terms of foreign trade and investment started in the 90s, particularly from the middle 90s onward. But already more than half were raised by 1987. So what happened in the 1980s? Something big happened in the 1980s, and that has to do with the agricultural sector in China. The 2 major things that happened. One is that China moved from the commune system to the household responsibility system, so individual got the use rights of land. It's a very important institutional change, nothing to do with globalization. Another important thing that happened at the same time, which is not widely commented upon, is that when China moved to the individual responsibility system, China carried out one of history's most egalitarian land distribution, land user rights distribution. Subject to 1 or 2 small qualifications, everybody got equal amount of land. What does it do? It provides a floor to poverty, because you cannot fall below a certain income, because you can fall back on this equal amount of land that you've got. This is in big contrast with India. India, to this day, 40 to 50% of rural households are either landless or almost landless. That's a big difference of the Indian poverty and the Chinese poverty. And this huge land reform, both from commune to individual plus egalitarian distribution of land, has nothing to do with globalization. So it's at most a half-truth to say that China did this through globalization. Yes, globalization played a positive role, particularly labor-intensive exports played a positive role in reducing poverty later, but more than half were already raised before then. And that's something that I wanted to emphasize. Let me very briefly say one or two words about inequality. Yes, Chinese inequality and Indian inequality is going up. But contrary to conventional wisdom, by most measures that economists use, Indian inequality is higher than Chinese. But more than that, if in the question-answer period I can go into this more detail, to me, more important than income inequality is inequality of opportunity. And inequality of opportunity in these two large, primarily agrarian countries depend on inequality of land distribution, inequality of education, and social inequality. In all these respects, Chinese inequality, even though they are high now, is less than India's. In one respect, social inequality, the comparative picture is somewhat mixed. And that has to do with gender. China is a highly gender imbalanced country. Let me see if I have this is a map which includes China and India. The darker it is, the more gender imbalanced the population is. So for example, the Chinese average, if you take 0 to, I think this figures are 0 to 6 years, 0 to 6 years children, in China's average is 122 boys for 100 girls. It's one of the world's highest. Of course, this is an implication of China's one-child policy. India, corresponding number is 109 boys for 100 girls. If you look at the regional distribution, large parts of central and southeast China, highly gender imbalanced. Corresponding gender imbalance in India is in Punjab and Haryana, which is northwest of India. But there are other respects in which gender inequality is less in China than in India, particularly in terms of female literacy, in terms of female participation in the labor force. Since my time is running out, let me quickly go into some other aspects. One is that now there's a standard story that India has a tremendous demographic window of opportunity because the Indian population is younger than Chinese, which is true. And this is called demographic dividend for India. The younger population contributes to economic growth in two ways. One, younger population is more productive than older population. And two, younger population saves more than the older population. So two things together, the younger population leads to higher growth rate, and that has led to prediction that very soon, India, utilizing this demographic dividend, the Indian growth rate is going to exceed the Chinese in near future. Probably true, but again, I would like to qualify this conventional wisdom now. Number one, it so happens that the Indian population is younger, not in the more successful parts of India. The parts of India in South India and West India, where the economic growth rates are better, their fertility rate is declining quite fast. Indian population is younger in the relatively backward, large provinces in North India. So there is a bit of discrepancy. Of course, people can migrate, but there are always barriers, cultural, physical, social, and economic barriers to migration. That's fact number one. Second is that the Indian population is less educated, by and large, than the Chinese. So what Chinese will lose out in terms of quantity of labor might make up somewhat in terms of quality of labor. So that's the second qualification to India's utilizing the demographic dividend. And the third is I already told you that the younger people save, not the older people, but the saving demographic is different from the working demographic. And I think I have a chart. So this is for China. So China is going to reach, the working age population is going to reach, is actually right around now. This is China working age population as proportion of total population. But this is the saving age proportion, because saving is somewhat later. So savers are going to peak in China in 2032, not immediately. So there is, again, that bit of conventional wisdom. Talking of saving, let me quickly say, which is well known, both countries, China and India, are both high saving countries, high compared to their per capita income. In fact, this is not well known. In household saving rate, India's household saving rate already exceeds that of China. But the total saving rate is higher in China than in India, because much of the saving in China is not household saving. It's corporate saving. It's the companies which retain earning and reinvest. But if you look at household saving, India's has already exceeded. Now, both of these countries, household saving rate is relatively high, primarily because whenever you come to some income, you save for your retirement, because the general population do not have retirement benefits. General population do not have health benefits. General population quite often have to save money for educating their children. So that's one of the main reasons why saving is high in both countries, as China, more than India, is doing more in terms of retirement, in terms of medical and education. Chinese saving rate is probably going to go down. The other thing I should talk about, investment in China and India. Both countries, the state has a lot of control over the banking system. But the Indian financial market is much more balanced than China's. In general, this reflects that the private corporate sector in India is much healthier and much more vigorous, and in some sense, much more dynamic than in China. This is a big plus point in favor of China, in favor of India. Let me, my time is running out, so I'm very quickly going to talk a little bit about politics. Let me go into that right away, since I've started talking about private capital. I'll just make 2 points. I'm going to go over a little bit. Number one, yes, to continue what I was just saying, private capital is much more vigorous in India. Today in China, more than half of industrial value added is contributed by private. But yet, many of the success stories are of globally successful state companies. What is not so well known is that some of these state companies are run by important politically powerful families in China. In fact, I recently saw a report of a study made by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. They wanted to find out the total number of Chinese residents who are multimillionaires. Actual number is, so the total number, this is for 2007, the total number of resident Chinese people who have more than 100 million yuan, which in 2007 would be about $14 million or above. What's the total number in this report? It comes to about 3,500. Of these 3,500, about 3,000 are relatives of high-ranking party officials. This to me is a very important number. It tells you a little bit about the nature of capitalism as it is developing. In fact, one of China's most well-respected senior economists, whom I met in Beijing, Wu Jinglian, has described this process as crony capitalism. There is crony capitalism in India as well, a cozy relationship between the capitalist oligarchy and the politicians, but nowhere near what it is in China. And this is something that is particularly the case where these people who are successful, economically successful, use the power of an authoritarian state to get their way. So quite often this capitalism takes the form not merely of corruption, but also a kind of predatory capitalism. That's something is a big difference between Chinese capitalism and Indian capitalism. And the last thing that I want to talk about is something that anybody who talks about China and India has to talk about, so I cannot skip that. And people say, well, the main difference between China and India is that one is a democratic country, the other is an authoritarian country. True, but not quite true, in the following sense, that, and in fact, you see this, whenever you go to Beijing, you see the Chinese elite also subscribes to this, that they have the best system of, this is authoritarian capitalism is the best system, particularly in the early stages of development. I do not believe in it. I think the relationship between authoritarianism or lack of authoritarianism and development is quite complex. And in fact, the longest chapter in my book is about that, about this particular complexity of relationship. Authoritarianism is neither necessary nor sufficient for development. And let me not, I don't have time to go into that. Let me just end with another piece of conventional wisdom which I'm going to qualify. And that is the following. In general, it is thought that China has a strong state. India is a weak state. And I understand in what sense people mean it. Chinese leadership seems quite efficient, takes decisions quickly, purposive, in that sense, strong leadership. India is a whole mess. And democracies in general tend to be messy, and India particularly is extremely messy. But the way I want to qualify the conventional wisdom, in some sense, India's strength is in the messiness. This messiness is quite often derived from a kind of democratic pluralism. And so, immediately after the financial crisis, when I was in China, my previous speaker already alluded to it, about the red line below which the rate of growth should not fall. I was told if the rate of growth falls very much below 8%, the regime would be in trouble. I joked with my friend in Beijing. I said, if the Indian growth rate falls to 0, nothing will happen. Because the Indian regime does not derive its legitimacy from the economic growth rate. Its legitimacy is derived from democratic pluralism. If democratic pluralism were not there, India would have broken into many pieces many years back. And this is something I find the Chinese elite quite often does not quite grasp. And yet, whenever there's a political crisis, the Chinese leadership overreacts, suppresses information, and acts heavy-handedly. This is the cause of political instability and political uncertainty looking to the future. India has a lot of problems, a lot of governance failures, particularly in delivering social services to the poor. So both countries, primarily I'd say both countries have what I would call failures of accountability. Indian democracy is rather weak at the local level, at the village level, at the municipal level. So there are accountability failures in both countries, and that's why my book is titled Awakening Giants, Feet of Clay, and the feet of clay have to do largely with accountability failures in both countries. Thank you.